Velkommen alle sammen! This is the most important video I have ever done. If you don't watch any of my other videos, I hope as many people as possible see this, because I've never seen someone break down feudalism like I'm about to do. As always, I make videos about history not for entertainment, but to learn from, so we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future, and we are in a very, very dangerous position in our time in history right now, about to repeat these same mistakes. So, feudalism. Legal, economic, military, cultural, and political customs that are derived from medieval Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries. A broad definition of what feudalism is difficult, and scholars don't agree on one definition, but maybe the most common one that we have is by Francis Ganzoff. Feudalism describes a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations which existed among the warrior nobility and revolved around the three concepts of lords, vassals, and fiefs. In other words, rules for thee and not for me. Okay, that is my humble definition of feudalism. Basically, class segregation and different rules and norms for each class, as I like to describe it. But first, why are we talking about this here on my channel? This channel is about Viking history. The Viking Age ended by the mid 1000s, 1066 is the official date the Viking Age ended, and feudalism really didn't start to come in full swing until maybe 100 years after that. So in a way, we can consider the Viking Age the last age before full-on feudalism. It was there in small amounts before, but before full-on feudalism was the Viking Age. And we can consider Scandinavia as the last real battleground for freedom and equality before feudalism took completely over in all Europe. Once a free Scandinavia fell, there was basically nothing to stop the larger powers from doing what they wanted all over Europe. And you'll see what I mean in the examples that I give. First, let's talk about the most common trait of feudalism, the warfare and the warrior class. One of the key elements of feudalism was that the warrior class of society and the fighting was reserved only for a certain group. You see, previously in a free and equal society before feudalism, every man was a warrior, and every man had the right to bear weapons and fight to defend his homeland. When a feudal society comes in, only a certain upper class of people in society have the wealth and resources to enable them to be a part of this fighting force. Or sometimes, only a certain class of people are allowed to bear weapons and be a part of that warrior class. And the rest of the population is disarmed. Does that sound like anything similar to today? So, this was very much the case in the Viking Age. In the Viking Age, the warfare was based on the fleet and infantry. Every man could basically pick up an axe or a spear or a sword if he could afford it, and any man could fight and walk into battle. The feudal society of continental Europe, however, was dominated by the cavalry and by knights in armor and the riding horses. You all know that stuff. What happened was weapons, armor, horses, and many other military resources became so expensive that the only people who could afford them were the nobles. And in some places, there were even laws prohibiting the peasants from owning these things. Think about that. Now, I bring this up as the first point, because all the crappy and unfair things that the noble class would end up forcing on the peasant class in the following hundreds of years, even if the peasants did stand up and fight for their freedom and equality, all the peasant class had was crappy little axe in one hand and maybe a little piece of leather here as a shield. And they were going up against nobles with swords, shields, armor, horses, training, organization, financial backing, the peasants stood absolutely no chance to fight back against all the other unjust things that were about to be implemented on them in the next couple hundred years. So that is step number 1 to feudalism. Number 2, protection of the ruling class we'll speak about. What happens next? Well, if things weren't bad enough for the peasants, now the ruling class, the royals at the time, all over in Scandinavia and Europe, they established a network of castles and fortifications. There are a few in Norway, at Akershus is the big one, Kalmar in Sweden, these are some of the oldest, Viborg in Finland, Helsingør in Denmark, but they had castles like this and they were in a network all over Europe. What were this for? Was it to do what the royals said it was for, in order to strengthen defense and organize the administration and provide a place of refuge for their citizens in the event of an invasion? Oh no, it wasn't, was it? It was built so that the ruling class could stay protected and not bear any consequences from the horrible things they were about to do to their people. You see, pre-feudalism and pre-feudal societies, kings, chieftains, generals, whoever, the most powerful men in the society, they lived right next door to their citizens. In the Viking Age, we hear stories, plenty of stories about the most powerful Viking kings walking through the middle of their village, eating, drinking, feasting with their people, doing sports activities, and celebrating holidays with the regular peasants of society. Rulers were not separated from their people in a pre-feudal and free society. Most castles that you know, by the way, in Europe were not even built until right around feudal times. The castles in Europe are not actually that old. Before feudalism, the rulers didn't feel the need to segregate themselves from their people in order to feel safe. But when you decide to take people's freedoms away and treat them unfairly, guess what? They don't like it. And then the rulers have to hide themselves behind high walls and guardsmen in order to feel safe from their own people. Who are they supposed to be serving? Does any of that sound familiar? Anyway, next point. What else happens in feudalism? So not only is the ruling class protected by armies and walls, and they disarmed the peasants so the peasants had no chance of standing up for themselves, what they also did was they restricted the peasants' diets. From the 1200s onwards, and a bit earlier in other places, many diets and countries were organized according to the status of the people. Not only did certain foods become so expensive that only the rich could afford proper diets, but in many places they actually implemented laws prohibiting the peasants from feeding themselves. Certain regulations on farming, certain herbs and wild forage plants became illegal. They were dismissed as pagan arts of the devil, so people couldn't forage, and even hunting and fishing became regulated and outlawed in many places, so the people couldn't even get the meat that they needed when they were starving. Was this the same for everyone in society? No, no, you silly peasants, only the nobles are permitted to hunt. So hunting was generally just a thing for the wealthy class, and eating well was a luxury of the nobility. Does any of that sound familiar? Can you think of any other ruling classes from some time that are trying to force a poor diet on their citizens? So, in feudal Europe, the upper class ended up being better fed. They ended up being bigger, healthier, stronger, taller, while the peasants were forced into starvation and malnutrition. There are exceptions for this, of course. Okay, I think a great one would be Braveheart. With Braveheart, William Wallace is a perfect example of a, feudal peasant, even though he was kind of considered a noble, but he fought for the peasants. And he was the #1 freedom fighter against feudalism, in my opinion. And he was a giant, so he was big. Also in feudal Sweden, it's pretty well known. And also in Norway, there was the class called the bønders, the free farmers. And in Norway was the same with the birkebeinerne. They were the poor peasants, but they still managed to feed themselves well, and they were still a formidable force. So there were exceptions, but in general, and we can even see this from the archaeological finds, that the nobility was better fed, healthier, and damn near twice the size and strength of the peasant class. In addition to being better armed and equipped and financed and organized and protected, that it made it impossible for any peasant rebellion. What else happened during feudalism? Well, the countries were in debt. Because of such worthless leadership by the ruling class, they were spending all this money to oppress their people and protect themselves from the revolts. Feudal nations went into great debt. The biggest one was Denmark under King Valdemar in the mid-1300s. They actually had to sell off Estonia and Halland in Sweden as attempts to restore Danish finances, because they were a part of the Danish kingdom at the time. Denmark also taxed its citizens heavily, and they took a toll from the ships leaving and entering the Baltic Sea, which was the main one, which they had no right to do. And this is just Denmark, but similar things happen everywhere. Look, worthless leadership put the homelands into great debt, and they have to put an outrageous tax on their people to compensate. Does any of that sound familiar? Thankfully, we have not reached the second part of that in the modern day, because the only thing left to do is the country starts selling parts of itself off to other countries, and like Denmark did back then. Next, let's talk about the taxes. So yes, in feudal societies, the citizens and lands were taxed heavily. So this seems weird to us today, but taxes were actually very low in ancient times. I'm just taking one example here from Sweden in the 1300s. They found the average farmstead paid like an average 32 grams of silver in taxes a year, okay? That was only about 2% value of the average farm at the time. And this tax rate is true for most ancient and pre-feudal societies. Tax rates were just a few percent. But then after feudalism came into Sweden, this was when they were under control by Germany in the late 1300s. The tax rate went from 2% to an outrageous 200 pieces of silver. So that went from 2 to almost 20% tax rate. Again, this is just one example, but the same types of things happened all over Europe. What the hell? 20% taxes is not that much. Yeah, to our slave minds today, that is not so much. We have to pay, 30 to 50% of the money that we earned ourselves doing back-breaking, soul-crushing work all day, and we're okay with that. So 20% is not that much. Just realize that ancient humans had revolts and civil wars if taxes even went from 2 to 3%, okay? A 1% increase in tax would have caused a civil war in most ancient cultures. So this increase in Sweden was at the time a very, very big deal. But hold on. Everyone pays taxes, right? Everyone pays their fair share of taxes, right? Right? Oh, no. Actually, they didn't. In Sweden, in the mid-1300s, the same time, the peasants were taxed, but the royals, nobility, clergy, anyone who actually had money, they were exempt from paying taxes. Does that sound familiar, any of this? What else? Next thing, this is the number one worst thing about feudalism, in my opinion. Believe what I want you to believe, or else. Now this part, even after I went over how horribly the peasant class was treated, in addition, the peasant class was not even allowed to believe in the things they wanted. Free speech and belief was outlawed. I'm primarily here speaking about the religious beliefs. When Christianity came in, they made paganism illegal. In Scandinavia especially, but it happened everywhere else too, but in Scandinavia especially, we have many law codes, records of this, from about the 1100s onward. that prohibit certain practices of the old pagan religion. I'm not talking about forbidding things like human sacrifice. Of course that was illegal. But the laws and the rulers even went as far as to outlaw going out at night and sitting. Or the old pagan belief that there were spirits in the waterfalls and hills. And I did a whole video on these that you can check out. All the laws against paganism from the time. So many simple, innocent cultural traditions that you would be executed for if you were caught. People could not even believe in the things they wanted. Does any of that sound familiar? A ruling class trying to force their beliefs on peasants and prohibiting any alternative viewpoints. I wonder what kind of a society that kind of thing would happen in. So all this sounds like absolute slavery. Yeah, okay, let's talk about slavery. So one thing you'll be surprised at is that there actually was no slavery in most of the feudal age. Slavery ended in most of these places before full-on feudal times. The slave trade in England was officially abolished in the year 1102, one of the first nations in Europe to do so. But the other northern European countries followed in the next 100 to 200 years. They outlawed slavery. Okay, so that's great. That's great, right? These primitive, pagan, barbarian ancestors of ours owned slaves. How horrible. And then feudalism comes in and it makes slavery illegal. Yeah, that's great, of course. Slavery is horrible. But hold on a sec. What happens? Were they actually freed? Oh no, they weren't. Feudal societies, maybe people called themselves free, but they didn't even have the freedom to believe what they wanted, and they absolutely had no ability to stand up for themselves if they did want any freedom. On top of that, they were taxed, they were treated unfairly, they were done all these things that I could do before, and guess what? They had given away their weapons and given away their right to fight a long time ago, so there was a grand total of jack shit that they could do about it, okay? So slavery didn't go anywhere, guys. It was officially abolished in feudal times. Then it made a return, by the way, once the Europeans found some poor souls in foreign countries that they could go and slave again. And then slavery was again abolished a few hundred years later. And it goes around in the same cycle. It keeps going around and around. Slavery legal, slavery illegal, every 1,000 years or so, all over the world. Slavery doesn't go anywhere, guys. The only difference is how well the slaves were treated. Because in Viking Age Scandinavia, the slaves were treated pretty well. That's the first difference, how well the slaves were treated in different times, different places. Of course, not all slavery is equal. Some had it a lot worse than others, and that's a horrible thing. So that's the first difference. But the second and more important difference is whether the slaves knew they were free or not. Whether the slaves actually believed that they were free, and whether they really were. Guess which period we are in now, guys, and which one might be coming around in the next few generations. So after that, what did the peasants do? Didn't they stand up and fight? Didn't they ever rise up? Anything like that? Well, yeah, they did. But I'm sorry to say it, guys, that is the worst part of all when the peasants stood up and fight. The final result and final nail in the coffin is the brutal civil wars that came during feudalism. In Norway in the late 1100s, early 1200s, we had a long, very bloody time of civil wars. These are the famous Birkebeinerne that you have heard of. There were civil war in many parts of Danish-ruled areas, Frisia being the biggest one. They fought back in the mid-1200s. The Iceland civil wars were very brutal. They had a stretch of long, bloody civil strife and lawlessness, like pure anarchy in the early 1200s. And of course, we cannot forget Braveheart, all right? Which the peasantry of Scotland at the time, in the late 1200s, was absolutely going through the same struggle as their Scandinavian distant relatives. So lots of civil war, lots of bloodshed. In all these places, unfortunately, it ends in bloody civil wars. Frankly, directed at the wrong enemies, okay? I wish I think we all wish, like in feudal times, the peasants, the citizens, would have risen up and went after the elites, went after the nobles, right? Went after the royalty because they were the ones who did all these cruel things upon them. Unfortunately, that's not the way it goes. The peasants had become so programmed and so slave-minded that they fought amongst each other. Brothers fighting against brothers, enormous death tolls, extremely cruel and harsh times, and it eventually gets to the point where people were so cruel and brutal to each other, these peasants that have been angry for and oppressed for hundreds of years, it gets to the point that another country actually has to come in and take control to get some peace back into the place. Best example of this is when it happened in Iceland. After many years of bloody civil war, they submitted to Norwegian rule in the mid-1200s. Denmark, too, a bit later on, took control of all Scandinavia. And on top of that, what else? to make things even worse, we had the Black Plague that came around in the 1300s and wiped out of a third of the European population, or at least what was left of the European population after the Civil Wars. What happens then? Well, after most people had died from either civil war or disease, well, the good old nobles, they come back around, and out of the kindness of their hearts, they snatch up all the land for a low price that are left behind by the widows. And now the upper class owns even more than they did before. This happens all over, again and again. The feudal age, this happened. The collapse of the Roman Empire, this happened. The Bronze Age collapse before that happens every 1,000 years or so. I did a video on this a while back. This same kind of process happens. So that sounds crazy. I think you may recognize a couple, maybe one or two of the things in this video. Maybe you don't recognize some of that. What does that tell us? Well, we're right in the middle of these times, guys. It has already started. Hopefully the second half of the story does not happen to us, but I am not so optimistic. What are the solutions to this? I don't think there is solutions. I think this is just a natural process of humanity. And I think too many people are brainwashed and unable to see the things coming from them. So that's why I speak about these videos, so we don't repeat the same mistakes. But it goes on deaf ears if not enough people know this history, because then we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. So I don't think there is any solution to this other than try and become a noble, try and become an upperclassman, because this is the only, class that constantly wins, where the peasant class is not treated well at all. So if we can't save the whole peasant class, we can at least save our family and our lineage. And the only way to do that is to make wealth and become a noble, just like they did in feudal societies. Because once that happens, once feudalism completely kicks in, there is no ability to ascend into being a noble. Peasants are peasants, and there was nothing you could do, no matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you save, no matter how smart you are. There was no way to ascend in the classes. In a feudal society, the opportunity is only there in a pre-feudal society. So thankfully, we are still on that point where you can generate wealth and help yourselves and your family and future generations. So that is my only tip, but that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed. Share this if you like. Like I said, the more people watch this, the better, because this is a very important history that I hope we don't have to repeat. But that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.